welcome back to another edition of Civil Discussion on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. A pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, May 18th. Also a great pleasure to be joined by our co-host, Don Keelan. Don, good to have you back here in the studio.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
Well, we're going to try something a little bit different from what we've been doing recently in some of the shows we've hosted here. Today, we're going to sort of try and put our money where our mouths are, or maybe it's our mouths where our money is, or whatever, and engage in a civil discussion between the two of us around the subject of the Affordable Heat Act, or Clean Heat Standard, if you want. That's legislation that was passed by the Vermont State House a couple of weeks ago. Governor Phil Scott vetoed that bill. The legislature then went on and overrode his veto. So that piece of legislation is now off to the Public Utility Commission, or PUC, for tweaking, fine-tuning, developing how the Affordable Heat Act would actually work. The legislature will then check back on it in 2025 after that piece of legislation has been fully worked up. And, you know, the governor and the legislature will have another crack at whether or not they like the final version that has turned up. So we'll see. Basically, the act is designed to help Vermonters reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and encourage dealers who deal in fossil fuels like propane, fuel oil, to expand into perhaps other more climate-friendly heating options. We will see where that all goes. I'm going to guess from the start that Don and I have a slightly different take on whether or not this legislation moves us in the right direction or not. So, Don, let me just throw it over to you then. What are your concerns about this piece of legislation, or do you feel like ultimately it's going in the right direction? What do you think?
Well, I think you made a statement, how it will actually work. And this is where I have an exception to so much that's coming out of Montpelier, and that is how the bill will actually work. That we should not be passing legislation that we do not know how it's going to work, because it's too costly on the other end if it doesn't work. We've seen some of this recently, and I know when we were being a little bit more cautious back in, I believe it was 2011, when we were looking at universal health care, we said, look, this is a major piece of legislation that's going to have such a major impact on the state. We better know how it's going to work. So they actually, before they passed the legislation that adopted the universal, before they even thought about adopting it, they studied it, and they found out it was not going to work, and they paid a lot of money to find that out. And my take on the Affordable Heat Act, the Clean Heat Standard Act, seriously lobbied by a lot of different organizations. They don't know how it's going to work. And the beginning of it, when that act was first introduced in the Senate, it did not have this sending it over to the PUC for 2 years until I think January 2025 to study it. That was an add-on because I think some legislators came to their senses and realized we need to find out if this is going to work at all. Right? And that's my take on much of this. Am I against saving fuel or reducing our use of fossil fuel? Not at all.
Well, I mean, I guess my feeling on that is that, okay, it's a complicated subject. You know, they don't want legislators, well, nobody wants to see particularly lower and middle income Vermonters hammered by higher heating costs. That was one concern that came up over and over again in the course of the discussion, the run-up to the vote on this. There are several provisions put into the bill to try and encourage fuel oil dealers or other obligated parties, as the term goes, to provide incentives to lower income folks so that they won't be, you know, disproportionately hurt by it. I mean, to answer your main question about, well, nobody knows how it's going to work, yeah, it's an ambitious piece of legislation. It's one I also think is necessary, or something needs to be done in that area. So what is wrong with taking 2 years, or whatever it may turn out to be, and you know, really study it up close, see if this is a good way to go, or maybe it might turn out, like you suggest, with the health insurance that then Governor Peter Shumlin wound up, you know, canceling on because it just was too expensive, and he felt the state couldn't afford it. But this way, it's not like it's just being, you know, quote unquote rammed through, and you know, we'll figure it out as we go along. It's if the numbers come back, and I think one of the things that I found very disturbing about the whole conversation that led up to the passage of the bill was a lot of, you know, wild misinformation that was going on about how this was going to raise, you know, oil heating prices by 70 cents a gallon on absolutely no factual basis. So let's give the people who are probably the experts on this a chance to really drill down, analyze, and if in 2 years, you know, it comes back, well, yeah, they actually would raise oil prices by 70 cents, and the incentives that were built into it to encourage, you know, the obligated parties to, you know, provide incentives for lower income folks aren't going to work well. Well, I'll go try it again. Try to come up with something else. But I don't see what's wrong with having a check back after 2 years.
I don't disagree with you about a check back after 2 years, but the fact of the matter is, what I'm driving at, the initial proponents of this bill never had that in there. It took some real arm twisting to recognize that we don't understand this, and therefore let's have some agency, in this case the PUC, study it. Now, I had advocated to the legislature, and I had written to them that what we should do prior to even the adoption of this is to take an example of what it is that they want to do, and use a specific town, and because of the ability of computers today and the ability of model a town. And in my case, I suggested Arlington because it has a variety of different things. It has manufacturing, government, nonprofits, residents, and so forth. And use that as an example and model the whole town as to what it would take to convert everyone in Arlington to electric. And what would be the issues then that would come out of that we need to address. I'll give you a simple one. We remove all of the fossil fuel heating equipment, right? Particularly tanks, either propane tanks or fuel tanks, right? We remove cars, all right? What do we, just one issue among many, what do you do with that equipment that you're stripping out now, all right? Where does that go? How do we handle that? Who pays for that? That's just one example. But in the model, that would be addressed. All right, and the same thing with, we have electric lines down the major roads in Arlington, what they call the grid lines. Right? Are they capable of handling the electric? Not only are the lines physically capable of handling the power, is there power that can go into the lines to start out with? Will that be guaranteed if this town of 2,400 is going to go adopt all electric for everything? And all I'm saying is, let's see what the impact is, because eventually it's coming. The question is, you know, how are we going to deal with it? So,
well, maybe that might be part of what the PUC eventually winds up coming up with. I mean, I guess my first reaction is that, you know, we're not going to have to go all electric immediately. I mean, by 2040 or 2050, that might be something we'd need to do to kind of reach the Global Warming Solutions Act goals for the state, which I think is like 80% of below 1990 emissions by 2050. So that implies certainly, you know, getting rid of a lot of oil tanks and upgrading power lines, but
and cars.
And cars.
I mean, the cars, by the way, are sooner than that. The governor has even, I don't believe fossil fuel autos can be sold in Vermont after 2035.
Yeah, I'm not sure of that one, but I think you're correct on that. You remain here in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a whole host of issues around electric cars too, no question, including the grid capacity that you mentioned, the cost of the batteries, how are those batteries going to be made? How do we feel about the fact that right now China is the world's leading country in terms of manufacturing electric vehicles? They're way ahead of everybody else. They weren't burdened, I guess, by the legacy of gasoline-powered cars that we developed and had all the infrastructure that got built up around that. But that could be an issue. Where's the lithium and the other materials that go in are going to come from? But I guess the bottom line for me on this is like kind of what is the alternative? If the Clean Heat Standard or Affordable Heat Act is flawed in some way, what should we do instead? Because I don't think the status quo is acceptable.
Okay, well, we made a suggestion on that, if I may. I don't mean to interrupt you, but in a recent column, and I caught a bit of flack from the powers that be up in upstate, and that was we should change the way in which Efficiency Vermont operates. All of us in our electric bills make a payment to Efficiency Vermont. We make the payment to Green Mountain Power in our case, and they in turn transfers the money to the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, which owns Efficiency Vermont. Right? Basically, our utilities in Vermont transfer about $60 million a year. That's collected from the ratepayers, and it goes to Efficiency Vermont. And they, in turn, they're a consulting company, and they consult and tell you how you may want to energize your house. Right? And the company itself, the overall company, does a lot of this out of state to the tune of they're over $120 million company. I'm suggesting that Efficiency Vermont be spun off and get back to being an actual company that will actually weatherize and energize houses. And use that $60 million, which is what it is right now. Green Mountain Power, as of February, gave them something like $39,200,000 for the last fiscal year, and then you got the other 18 utilities that are contributing. And set up a company that will physically have employees come out to your house, weatherize your house, energize your house, and based on your income, be a charge for it. To get back to your question, what do you do? What can we do? Assuming, and I don't ignore the fact that we need to begin to reduce fossil fuels, which we are doing. According to my colleague at the Miles Fuel, 5 years ago, the average consumption in Arlington was, or his service, the customers he serviced, was about 1,300 gallons a year. It's down now to 700. And I know I can address that specifically myself. In our little 1,000 square foot office building, we were burning consuming something like 1,600 gallons of fuel a year in this fairly small building. I felt that was wrong. There's something that had to be changed there. And it had nothing to do with the pricing, although fuel was expensive. By the way, fuel was more expensive after the 2008 recession than based on inflation and so forth, than it is today. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's gone down. But in any event, so we decided to replace 15 windows in the office. Yeah, every time the wind blew, the window would shake. Right? We decided to take a 68 or 70% efficiency and make it into a 90% efficiency furnace, 92%. Right? We did that. It cost about $20,000, I think, the whole operation. Right? And this is a few years ago. Right? Last year, I ordered 500 gallons of fuel in the pre-buy. I got a notice the other day from Miles saying you burned 164 gallons less than you had ordered. So you burned only that's 335 gallons of fuel, compared to 1,600 a few years ago. Why? Because of we're conscious of turning the thermostat down at night. We have the windows, we have the weatherization, we have the insulation, we have a new furnace. Right, did I have to wait for the government to do this? Did I have to wait for a Clean Heat Standard Act? No. But I could afford to do it. And I think other people would like to do it, but they can't afford to do it. Right, and that's why I want this $60 million that we send every year to Efficiency Vermont, which is a consulting company. They do not go out and actually physically fix your building. And this answers your question. What can we? I think what can we do about it? Right? Locally, that's what we can do about it. Now, globally, there's other issues that we can't do anything about. Right?
Well, yeah, and
No.
the global piece of it is something I think this act is intended to kind of address. That nobody here in Vermont can control whether or not Russia invades Ukraine and drives the price of oil up, or other global events happen. Some prince in Saudi Arabia decides that they want to build a new golf course someplace and the price of oil goes up, whatever. I'm being facetious here, but
There you are.
but to kind of address what you were just saying there, which I think is great. I mean, you looked at your oil bill, you looked at the amount of oil you were burning, you thought by insulating the windows or putting in new windows, or maybe doing like a window dressers thing, if I can give a little plug for that program there that's going to be coming up. There'll be a build in Arlington, for instance, on that later this fall.
On what?
On the window dressers. They're like window inserts
yeah.
that kind of keep the heat in your house inside, and rather than letting it seep out through the window. I mean, all that's great, and yes, to some degree, the economics clearly drive some of that. I mean, rather than spending a lot of money on oil, you invested it in insulation and weatherization, and now you're reaping. You're probably breaking even already. So that's great. So I think this part of this bill also encourages more people to do that, or at least to take a look at it, or make it easier for them to do it. I know that for a lot of people, buying a heat pump, I've seen all kinds of prices on them. I know some of them can range pretty high, well beyond the budget of a typical ordinary family. But at least it's a step forward towards encouraging people to kind of at least look at that and giving them a bit of a discount on it. Now, as far as the Efficiency Vermont piece, I'm not as familiar with how they operate as you clearly are. You've studied this in much more depth than I have. I mean, if it's possible to take $60 million and give it out to folks to weatherize their homes or help them towards a purchase of a heat pump, then that's great.
No, let me stop you there. Not to help them, actually do the work.
As in install the pump?
This is a company now that would be reorganized. Right? It would hire, would train, send staff to apprentice school to learn how to weatherize homes. Don't forget, we have something like 100,000 homes that need to get weatherized between now and the next 10 years. We don't have the crew. The major weatherization company is up in Burlington. I think there are only 12 or 15 employees. Right? The problem is we got this goal, but we have no one to do the work. My suggestion is take the $60 million that is pulled out of our electric bill every month, all right? And this is the annual number, and take that and actually train people, supervise them, provide them with the materials, and go to Andy McKeever's house and actually physically do the work. And then if you can afford it, there'll be a scale, how much that you would charge, if not 100%, maybe nothing.
Well, I mean, that all sounds fine to me. I think there's been a lot of attention paid to the fact that there aren't enough skilled trades and craftsmen around the state to do that kind of work, like you say, and I think there's been a lot more emphasis appropriately placed vocational trades, being taught at the secondary school level and beyond, and encouraging young folks to kind of look at those types of careers that maybe 30 or 40 years ago, let's say, they weren't being directed towards, which I think was a mistake. But I think we realize now that we need more electricians, we need more carpenters, we need more plumbers, and folks who are skilled at weatherization or weatherizing homes. So,
how about taking 5,000 of the people down on the border and bringing them to Vermont and training them?
Well,
I mean, just like they took the Irish and the Germans and they built, and the Chinese, and they built the railroads.
well, that's another long discussion we could have around that. My shorthand answer to that is absolutely. Why not? I mean, there's an incredible paradox, it seems to me, between the fact that we have tens of thousands of people south of the border in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico who were desperate to come here.
Yeah.
And there are all these people up here who are looking for employees and are having a hard time finding them. Why we can't match up those folks down there to bring them up here, give them the documentation that they need to live legally and not in the shadows, has been a mystery to me for a very long time.
Well, yeah, and was it now, the number I think I read the other day, it's 27,000 open jobs in Vermont. I'd like to go back on the clean heat standard. Why are we so hell-bent on doing something in Vermont about this? We're not going to have any impact.
Yes, we are.
Okay, we are.
We are going to have an impact.
Yeah, yeah. How big an impact, please?
Well, I don't know the exact numbers. I'm sure yes, I know many people have said to me, well, what's the big deal? Every day there's a new coal-fired plant being built somewhere in the world, and that's offsetting by a factor of 1,000 anything we're doing here. If everyone takes that same approach, that same attitude, that, well, gee, it's just we're like 1/10 of 1% of this or that, and our impact is negligible, and then nothing's ever going to happen. I mean, there's always going to be an excuse for, what, does that mean that California or Texas or some of the bigger states, that means they can say, hey, we're only this much of it, so it's not up to us to kind of take the lead on it. I mean, the other factor I think is kind of interesting is that on a per capita basis, if you break it down on a per capita basis, we here in Vermont use more energy, more fossil fuel energy than people in a lot of places, because we drive cars all over the place. We have to, because there's no public transportation, and a lot of us heat our homes with oil or propane. So on a per capita basis, we are having an outsized impact beyond just the fact that Vermont's a small state of 640,000 people. But beyond that, I mean, I think you could say it's a moral thing that, everyone needs to do their share, and it starts someplace. And I'm not saying it's starting here, because this conversation has been happening now for a long time. But I just don't see that argument where, since Vermont is such a small piece of the entire global climate change issue, that's a reason to not do something.
I shared with you before, I was doing something to save some money.
Right.
And yeah, by the way, I'm reducing the amount of fossil fuel that's being burned. Right? Excuse me. It's not that you not want to do anything. You mentioned it's the moral thing. Right, let me ask you about that just for a second. Now, don't be rolling your eyes, but
no, I'm not. I'm just looking at the clock.
Huh?
I'm just looking at the clock.
You mentioned the moral thing, right? Let's take electric cars, for example. Let's talk about the moral thing and using an electric car, all right? And compare that to it's the moral thing to look in Vermont to save, the good old fossil fuel. An electric car supposedly uses 6 times its weight in minerals. I'm talking about cobalt, nickel, aluminum, magnesium, bauxite, and so forth. Right? And let's take the last one, bauxite. I think that's the way you pronounce it. Where does that come from? It comes from Guyana, the biggest producer. Where is Guyana? It's on the northwest coast of Africa. What are we doing there? They are devastating that country today. The 13 million people there are being devastated. Their rivers, their lakes, their villages, and their roads are all being devastated with this mining operation that's going on. All right? Why? Because we need that material. Now you go to the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Right? They produce a substantial portion of the world's cobalt. Mm-hmm. Right? Their mining operation, according to the UN, has the unregulated mining has over 200,000 people, of which 5 to 35,000 are children. Some of them are 6 years old, because that's artesian mining, meaning it has to be done by hand. and that's what they have. All right. Do we care about this? As long as we don't see it, right? But those minerals, all 6 of them, for the most part, have to be smeltered and are smeltered in China. China does control the bulk of the smeltering operations for these special minerals. In addition to what you were saying earlier, the production of battery, they do make electric cars. They do, I think, make 75% of the world's batteries as of right now. But they control this smeltering. To create smeltering, you have to have furnaces, big furnaces. They've created a whole series of coal-fired furnaces now, and they're using coal. So what impact are we having? And how about the moral side of it? Do I want to buy a car that's made with materials that are being extracted in countries that the people are so poverty? And by the way, Guyana is the poorest country in the world, not according to Keelan, but according to the UN. To use the moral issue, I think is you need to be prepared, and this is our discussion with you. You need to be prepared to address the moral issue about where cars are made. And then, may I just finish?
No.
The electric that you're going to use for this car, right, and the electric you're going to use for this heat pump, in our case, comes from Green Mountain, for the most part, Green Mountain Power. Green Mountain Power buys a substantial amount of electricity from Hydro-Quebec, a foreign country. Hydro-Quebec is running out of fuel, out of electricity. They need to increase their production by 25%. All right? To do that, they have to invade the lands of the native Canadians, and, as they already have, and now they need more. Right? You want to continue on the moral issue?
You make an excellent point. The moral side of it is very complex. I mean, I could say, well, the other moral aspect of it is, what about all those islands in the Pacific Ocean that are about to go underwater because of climate change? And gee, that's kind of sad to see that happen. But that's a super complicated way to put it. But I guess my main feeling is that economics usually is the driver of a lot of this stuff, and it's time to harness the economics to kind of make this work. But to try in the 30 seconds or so that we have left to just address that underlying question you had of why should Vermont worry about it? Yeah, I mean, economics aside, other than the fact that, like you did with your windows, you can save some money by investing in weatherization measures. It gets really easy, I think, and a bit of a slippery slope if one state says, we're not going to do anything about it because our impact is small, and that very quickly becomes countries can decide they don't need to do anything about this because, hey, we only burn a fraction of fossil fuels around the world, and I think that very quickly becomes an excuse for nobody to do anything. But I'm not saying that we're the leaders in this either. I mean, I don't think that we're the first ones out of the gate on this whole question. It's a case of everybody's going to have to do their share at some point. People in Oklahoma and Texas and West Virginia and all the other places that may not feel like, hey, this is their problem, but it is going to be their problem. Okay, so Don, we've been talking about this now for very close to half an hour. We're just about out of time. We can pick this up again and continue this conversation another time, because I think that would be really great to do that. But I am afraid we're going to have to leave it there for today, though. Thank you very much for. Let's change. The new change here. Obviously, we will have guests on from time to time. But I thought it was interesting. Yeah, I think this was kind of a lot of fun, and I think we ought to do this again. And the idea was and I hope, folks, you felt that we had a civil conversation. I think we did. I think so. I mean, they'll have to make the decision on that. All right. But anyway, well, thank you for sharing part of your day with us. Hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking, and that I was right and Don was not. Yeah. And we'll see you again the next time. All right. Take care. All right.